She was humiliated and forced off the plane. But just minutes later, the same flight attendant who shamed her was begging for forgiveness. What happened next changed the entire airline forever. The airport was buzzing with the usual pre-flight chaos. Passengers rushed to their gates, airline staff barked out boarding instructions, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sterile smell of overused air conditioning. Among the sea of travelers, a young black woman walked calmly toward the first-class boarding lane, her movements unhurried, her expression unreadable. She was dressed simply, well-fitted slacks, a tailored blazer, and a small carry-on bag slung over her shoulder. Nothing about her screamed wealth or importance, and perhaps that was why no one gave her a second glance. At the front of the line, a flight attendant with an impeccably neat uniform and a clipped professional smile greeted passengers as they handed over their tickets. When it was the young woman's turn, the smile flickered, just for a moment. The attendant's eyes scanned her from head to toe, subtle but unmistakably judgmental. "Ma'am, this is the first-class lane," the attendant said, voice carefully polite, but with a hint of skepticism. The woman met her gaze, unbothered. "I know," she said simply, handing over her boarding pass. The flight attendant took the ticket, her manicured fingers pausing as she read the details. Her eyebrows creased slightly, as if something didn't add up. She glanced back at the woman, then at the ticket again. The name on it, those two words, should have rung a bell, should have set off alarms in her head. But arrogance is a dangerous thing, and the attendant was too caught up in her own assumptions to pay attention. She forced a stiff smile and handed back the ticket. "Right this way," she said, stepping aside with reluctance. The young woman walked past without another word, heading down the jet bridge. A few steps behind her, an older man in a sharp business suit watched the interaction closely. He frowned slightly, as if something about her seemed familiar. He opened his phone, fingers flying over the screen as he searched for a name. Her name. But before he could confirm his suspicions, the line moved forward, and he let the thought drift away. Inside the plane, the woman found her seat in first class and settled in. She placed her bag neatly under the seat in front of her, then leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the muffled sounds of the boarding process. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple cast sideways glances at her, their expressions puzzled. They whispered to each other, and she could almost hear the words forming in their minds. Does she really belong here? She was used to it. The flight attendant from earlier reappeared, moving through the cabin with a professional air, ensuring that each first-class passenger was comfortable. When she reached the young woman's row, she hesitated. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, voice a little too firm. "May I see your boarding pass again?" The woman opened her eyes, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "I already showed it to you," she replied, her tone light, but carrying an edge of quiet authority. "I just need to confirm something," the flight attendant insisted. The woman sighed but complied, retrieving the ticket from her pocket and handing it over. The attendant examined it, as if expecting to find some mistake, some reason to tell this woman she was in the wrong seat. But the details were correct. First class, a fully paid-for ticket, no loopholes to exploit. Still, the attendant wasn't satisfied. "One moment," she said, turning on her heel and striding toward the flight deck. The woman watched her go, then glanced across the aisle, where the business-suited man from earlier was now staring at her, phone in hand. His eyes flickered with something close to recognition. And then, just as he opened his mouth to say something, the flight attendant returned. This time, with a uniformed airline security officer following closely behind. A tense silence fell over the cabin. The moment the uniformed officer stepped into the first-class cabin, the air shifted. Conversations hushed, heads turned, and an almost imperceptible tension settled over the passengers. The flight attendant stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression tight, with forced professionalism. The young woman in the seat barely reacted. She remained seated, her posture relaxed, watching the scene unfold like an outsider observing a performance. The officer, a broad-shouldered man with a clipped badge shining on his chest, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to step off the aircraft," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. A few passengers exchanged curious glances, while others pretended not to watch, though their ears were tuned to every word. The businessman from earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the phone in his lap. The young woman tilted her head slightly. "On what grounds?" Her voice was calm, measured, entirely unshaken by the presence of authority. The flight attendant spoke before the officer could answer. "There's been a mix-up with your ticket," she said, her words laced with artificial sweetness. "It seems like there might have been an error in the system." A pause. The young woman let out a quiet breath, something like amusement flashing in her eyes. "An error?" she echoed. The officer shifted uncomfortably. He had been called to remove a passenger, but now, under the steady gaze of this woman, doubt crept into his stance. He glanced at the flight attendant, who gave him a pointed look. "Yes, ma'am," he said, clearing his throat again. "We need to verify some information before you can take this flight. It'll be easier if we do this outside the aircraft." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A woman in pearls whispered to her husband. A man 2 rows back shook his head, clicking his tongue. The businessman leaned forward slightly, brows furrowed, as if trying to place where he had seen this woman before. The young woman exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much patience she had left. Then, she nodded once. "All right," she said, reaching for her bag and standing up with an effortless grace. She wasn't humiliated. She wasn't even angry. She simply followed the officer down the aisle, past the wide-eyed passengers who now watched with something resembling guilt. As she reached the exit, the businessman from earlier abruptly stood up. His voice, hesitant but firm, cut through the thick silence. "Wait," he said. The flight attendant turned, startled. "Sir, please remain seated," she instructed automatically. But he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was locked onto the young woman, realization dawning across his face. He lifted his phone, turning the screen outward. Her face stared back at them from the website of a major financial news outlet. A headline, bold and impossible to miss, declared, "Maya Sinclair acquires majority stake in Horizon Airlines." A beat of silence. Then a gasp. The flight attendant paled. Maya Sinclair. The name she had ignored, the details she had brushed aside. The woman she had just forced off the plane wasn't just a passenger. She owned the airline. The businessman took a step forward. "Ms. Sinclair," he said, his tone shifting to one of immediate deference. "Is there—" But Maya held up a hand. Her expression hadn't changed. If anything, there was a faint glimmer of something unreadable in her eyes. The flight attendant stumbled over her words. I didn't realize." Maya smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't triumphant. It was simply knowing. "You didn't ask," she said softly. The murmurs among the passengers turned into a low rumble. The officer, now understanding the gravity of the situation, took a small step back. The flight attendant opened and closed her mouth, her entire demeanor unraveling. Maya glanced around, taking in the wide-eyed stares, the awkward shifting of bodies, the subtle shame creeping into the atmosphere. Then, With effortless poise, she turned to the officer. "I assume there's no issue with my ticket anymore?" The officer shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am. I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." Maya nodded once. "Then I'd like to return to my seat." She walked past the frozen flight attendant without another glance, moving back down the aisle with the same quiet confidence she had entered with. But now, the silence wasn't dismissive. It was respect. Maya walked back down the aisle, her steps steady, unhurried. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely. The same passengers who had watched her with indifference, or worse, quiet judgment, now couldn't take their eyes off her. A few of them had their phones out, discreetly searching her name, their screens lighting up with news articles and corporate reports that confirmed what the businessman had just revealed. The flight attendant, still standing near the entrance, looked as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her service manual, her mind scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. But there was no salvaging this. Maya reached her seat and placed her bag back under the compartment with the same deliberate grace she had before. Then, she sat down, crossing one leg over the other. The businessman who had spoken up hesitated before clearing his throat. "Ms. Sinclair," he began cautiously, "I just want to say that I deeply respect." Maya turned her head slightly, offering him a polite but distant smile. "Enjoy your flight," she said smoothly, her tone leaving no room for further conversation. The businessman understood immediately. He had spoken up too late. The murmurs in the cabin continued, the weight of realization settling over everyone, like an oppressive fog. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging looks of unease. Others simply stared at Maya with a newfound awe, as if seeing her for the first time. Then, the flight attendant moved. With forced composure, she straightened her uniform and stepped forward, her lips pressing into a thin smile that barely concealed her panic. "Ms. Sinclair," she said, her voice now carefully measured, each syllable laced with artificial warmth. "I'd like to personally apologize for the misunderstanding. It was never my intention to make you feel unwelcome." Maya exhaled through her nose, a quiet amusement flickering in her eyes. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to grow unbearable. "Is that so?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. The flight attendant swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. If there's anything I can do to make your experience more comfortable, perhaps a complimentary drink, or an upgrade to—" Maya let out a quiet chuckle. Not loud, not mocking, but enough. "An upgrade," she repeated, amusement clear in her voice. "I wasn't aware first class had an upgrade." The attendant's face flushed. I only meant—" Maya lifted a hand, stopping her. "You meant to smooth this over," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "To make this moment disappear. But tell me, if I weren't who I am, if I were just a regular passenger, sitting in this same seat with the same ticket, would you be offering me the same courtesy now?" The flight attendant opened her mouth, but no words came, because there was no answer that wouldn't condemn her. The silence in the cabin grew thicker. A few rows back, a mother clutched her young daughter's hand, looking at Maya with something that resembled admiration. The businessman from earlier sat rigid in his seat, his eyes downcast, as if suddenly ashamed of how long it had taken him to say something. The flight attendant inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the edge of her service tray. "Ms. Sinclair, I truly—" But Maya wasn't finished. She turned slightly in her seat, so she was fully facing the woman now. Her expression remained composed, but there was an undeniable steel in her gaze. "Tell me," she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. "How long have you worked for this airline?" The flight attendant blinked. The shift in conversation caught her off guard. 7 years," she answered hesitantly. Maya nodded, as if considering that. 7 years, she mused. "That's a long time. You must be very familiar with company policy." The woman stiffened. "Of course, ma'am." "Good," Maya said smoothly. "Then you must also know that discrimination, whether implicit or explicit, is grounds for immediate review. And considering the nature of this incident, well." She let the sentence hang in the air, its implications clear. The flight attendant's face drained of color. "Ms. Sinclair, please," she stammered. It wasn't personal. I was just doing my job." "Were you?" Maya asked, her tone sharp for the first time. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looked like you were doing something else entirely." The woman's breath hitched. Maya let the words settle. Then, she leaned back slightly, her composure never wavering. "I'm not unreasonable," she continued. "I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability." The flight attendant opened her mouth again, but Maya wasn't looking at her anymore. She had already shifted her gaze toward the front of the cabin, where a senior flight supervisor stood, having just entered the scene after hearing the whispers travel up to the cockpit. His expression was tense. He had already been briefed, and he knew there was no undoing the damage now. Maya's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Perhaps we should call corporate," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I'd love to discuss the state of customer service on my airline." The flight attendant inhaled sharply, her panic now impossible to hide. And for the first time since the entire ordeal began, she realized she wasn't in control anymore. Maya was, and there was nowhere left to run. The senior flight supervisor stepped forward, his face drawn tight with forced professionalism. He had witnessed corporate nightmares before, but nothing quite like this. A scandal involving the new majority owner of the airline, on one of their own flights, was beyond catastrophic. "Ms. Sinclair," he began carefully, hands clasped in front of him. "On behalf of Horizon Airlines, I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate incident." Maya turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. "Unfortunate?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. The supervisor swallowed. "I assure you, this does not reflect the values of our airline. The behavior of our staff was inappropriate, and I take full responsibility for ensuring that corrective action is taken." The flight attendant standing beside him was visibly shaking now, her face drained of all color. Maya studied them both for a long, weighted moment. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Every passenger was watching, waiting to see what she would do. Then, she exhaled softly, glancing down at her perfectly manicured nails. "Tell me," she said casually, "if I had never revealed who I was, would there have been an apology at all?" The supervisor hesitated. The answer was obvious. Maya nodded, as if she already knew. "That's what I thought," she murmured. The flight attendant finally broke. "Please, Miss Sinclair," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I didn't mean—" Maya lifted a hand, silencing her effortlessly. "You didn't think," she corrected, "and that's the problem." A slow, almost unbearable silence stretched between them. Then, with deliberate grace, Maya reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone. The supervisor stiffened. The flight attendant's breath caught in her throat. Maya unlocked the screen with a swipe, then pressed a single button before raising the phone to her ear. "Yes," she said, her voice smooth. "It's me." The entire cabin held its breath. She listened for a moment, her expression calm, then continued. "I'm currently on Flight 227, en route to New York. There's been an incident, one that needs immediate attention. A pause. The supervisor's jaw tensed. The flight attendant's fingers curled into her uniform. Maya's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Yes," she said. "I'll be making some personnel changes when we land." The flight attendant's knees nearly buckled. Maya ended the call and tucked her phone away. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned back to the supervisor and raised a perfectly arched brow. "I assume there won't be any further disruptions to my flight?" The man shook his head so quickly it was almost comical. "No, ma'am. Absolutely not." Maya nodded once. "Good." Then, with an air of finality, she turned back to her seat and sat down, crossing her legs effortlessly. The message was clear. The conversation was over. The flight attendant remained frozen in place, her eyes wide with realization. She had made a fatal mistake, and there was no undoing it now. Passengers around them exchanged hushed murmurs, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Some of them had remained silent when Maya was being mistreated. Now, they watched her with something entirely different. Respect, and perhaps a little bit of fear. As the flight supervisor muttered something under his breath and ushered the trembling flight attendant away, Maya leaned back into her seat, staring out the window as the plane began its taxi to the runway. The turbulence was over, but for some, the real storm had just begun. The plane had taken off, soaring through the sky, but the tension in the cabin had yet to settle. The flight attendant, now visibly shaken, had been quietly escorted to the galley, her usual air of authority completely stripped away. She didn't return to first class. Maya, however, remained poised, untouched by the chaos she had effortlessly commanded. She sat with an air of quiet control, fingers tracing the edge of the armrest as she gazed out the window. The city below shrank into a distant memory, just as this moment would soon become a lesson, one that no one on this flight would forget. Across the aisle, the businessman who had recognized her shifted awkwardly in his seat. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer another apology, but one glance at Maya's composed expression made him think better of it. Instead, he simply exhaled, adjusting his tie with newfound discomfort. The other passengers, too, had changed. Some who had been indifferent now stole glances at her with thinly veiled respect. Others, who had watched in silent approval as she was escorted off the plane, now sat stiffly, their discomfort palpable. Actions had consequences. At the front of the cabin, the flight supervisor returned, his demeanor now one of pure deference. "Ms. Sinclair," he said carefully, "if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Maya didn't look at him. She simply took a sip of her water, her voice as smooth as ever. "I already have everything I need." The supervisor hesitated, then gave a slight nod before retreating, leaving her undisturbed. Maya inhaled deeply, allowing the moment to settle. The damage had been done. The lesson had been taught. Now, it was just a matter of time before the consequences followed. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet hum of the aircraft wash over her. For her, this flight was just another business trip. For the airline, it was the beginning of a reckoning. As the flight settled into cruising altitude, Maya exhaled softly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She had seen this happen too many times before. People making snap judgments, underestimating those who didn't fit their narrow definitions of power. But today, the lesson had been swift and undeniable. A flight attendant had tried to remove her from her own airline, and now, that same flight attendant would have to face the consequences of her own prejudice. Maya glanced out the window, watching the endless sky stretch before her. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about setting a precedent. Respect wasn't something you handed out selectively. It was something everyone deserved, whether they owned the airline or not. As the plane continued its journey, a quiet hush lingered in first class. No one dared to speak to her now, but that was fine. The silence itself was a sign of recognition. Then, just before she closed her eyes to rest, the businessman across the aisle finally gathered the courage to whisper, "Ms. Sinclair, I think you just changed the airline forever." Maya opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a calm certainty. "Good," she said simply. And with that, she leaned back, letting the hum of the aircraft carry her forward. To the next meeting, the next decision, the next move that would remind the world exactly who she was. But now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone underestimated you, only to regret it later? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to read them. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More powerful stories are coming your way. Stay tuned.